2:09 a.m. Baltic Sea. The air traffic control sector covering the northern Baltic is divided between Finland's Finavia and Sweden's LFV Luftfartsverket, with coordination points at the Vantaa and Stockholm centers. At 2:09:04 a.m., the Stockholm Center's primary radar system registered an anomalous return in sector ESAA, a diffuse low-intensity return occupying approximately 40 square kilometers of airspace over the Gulf of Bothnia at altitudes between 4,000 and 8,000 feet. The return was not consistent with any filed flight plan in the sector. It was not consistent with the radar signature of a single aircraft. It was not consistent with weather phenomena in the current meteorological profile. The night was clear, no precipitation, no convective activity. The Stockholm controller flagged the anomalous return at 2:09:19 a.m. and transmitted a standard traffic alert to the Military Airspace Coordination Cell at the Swedish Armed Forces Air Operations Center at Luftstridsskolan. The military cell's duty officer received the alert at 2:09:31 a.m. His analysis of the return took 4 minutes. His assessment at 2:13:44 a.m. used a classification that appeared in the Swedish Armed Forces Air Defense Doctrine Handbook under the category of anomalous air returns requiring escalated analysis, probable aerial dispersal event. Aerial dispersal event meant something specific in the Doctrine Handbook's glossary. It referred to the deliberate release of material from airborne platforms over a geographic area, material that could be agricultural, industrial, environmental, or in the worst-case classification, biological or chemical. The aircraft that had conducted the dispersal, the N-12 operating under civil registration, was the element of the operation whose legal status was most immediately significant. An aircraft conducting a radar masking dispersal over international waters was not self-evidently illegal under any specific provision of international aviation law. The International Civil Aviation Organization's standards and recommended practices addressed the operation of civil aircraft in ways that required safe and orderly conduct and compliance with filed flight plans. The An-12 had deviated from its flight plan. That deviation was a potential regulatory violation under the Chicago Convention's flight plan adherence requirements, a violation that would be investigated by the civil aviation authorities of the states whose airspace it had transited and whose outcome would depend on whether the deviation could be attributed to navigational error, operational necessity, or deliberate intent. Deliberate intent to conduct a radar masking operation in support of a military approach maneuver was not an outcome that the Chicago Convention's violation adjudication framework had been designed to process. The framework had been designed for navigational errors, weather deviations, and communications failures. The material that would later be identified as the content of the dispersal event was not biological or chemical. It was metallic chaff filament, billions of thin aluminum-coated fibers, each approximately 0.3 millimeters in diameter and between 10 and 25 millimeters in length, dispersed from an altitude of 6,000 feet across a footprint of approximately 38 square kilometers over the Gulf's shipping approaches. The chaff was a physical countermeasure. It was also, in the specific configuration and density of the dispersal, a radar masking agent capable of degrading the air search radar coverage of the Swedish Air Force's Saab GlobalEye surveillance aircraft and the ground-based GIWS radar network covering the northern Baltic approaches for between 40 and 90 minutes following dispersal, depending on wind speed and atmospheric mixing. The dispersal had occurred at 2:07 a.m., 2 minutes before the Stockholm controller noticed the return. The 2-minute delay was the detection gap that the dispersal's altitude and initial particle density had been designed to produce. At 2:07 a.m., while the chaff cloud was settling over sector ESAA, 3 PLA Air Force H-6K bombers that had been operating in international airspace over the Barents Sea as part of a Russian-sponsored joint exercise had altered their course. The alteration was small. 14 degrees to the southwest from a course that had been taking them back toward their northern deployment point to a course that placed them in a transit corridor over the Norwegian Sea toward the northern Baltic. The course alteration occurred at an altitude of 9,200 meters, well above the Chaff cloud's 4,000 to 8,000 foot dispersal band. The H-6Ks were not in the Chaff cloud. The H-6Ks were behind the Chaff cloud, using its radar masking effect as cover for their course alteration. The intelligence preparation that had preceded the operation was visible in retrospect in a way that it had not been visible in real time. The Russian-Chinese Joint Air Patrol exercise had been announced publicly 12 days before the Chaff dispersal. Its route had been filed with Russian aviation authorities and made available through standard NOTAM channels. The exercise route had taken the H-6K formation over the Barents Sea, a standard area for Russian and Chinese joint exercises that had been conducted periodically since 2019. The proximity of the Barents Sea transit to the northern Baltic approaches was a function of geography. The announcement of the exercise had been monitored by NATO's air surveillance architecture and assessed as a routine bilateral activity. No element of the 12-day pre-exercise period had generated an intelligence indicator that the exercise was designed to position the H-6Ks for a Baltic approach maneuver. The exercise had been the cover. Its announcement had been the authentication mechanism that made the cover convincing. The intelligence community's post-incident analysis would identify the specific planning decision that separated this joint patrol from the preceding 6. Only this patrol had been routed through the exact airspace that placed the H-6Ks in optimal position for a 22-minute approach to the Swedish airspace boundary following a course alteration. The joint exercise with Russia had provided the H-6Ks their location in the operational area. The Chaff dispersal had been conducted by a single turboprop aircraft, a modified An-12 transport with Russian civil aviation registration, operated by a logistics company in St. Petersburg, whose ownership structure included 4 shell entities and a Belarusian limited liability company that had filed a flight plan for a cargo run from Murmansk to Kaliningrad. Deviated from its logged route over the Gulf of Bothnia, performed the dispersal and resumed its logged course. The An-12 had been airborne for 3 hours and 41 minutes at the time of the dispersal. Its flight plan had been logged with Finavia 48 hours earlier. Its registration was current. Its transponder had been transmitting continuously throughout its flight. None of the actors were directly connected. The H-6K exercise was a Russian-Chinese bilateral activity that had been announced publicly 12 days earlier as a routine joint air patrol. The An-12 was a civil-registered cargo aircraft operated by a company with no formal connection to any military authority. The Chaff dispersal could be attributed to the An-12, but would require forensic analysis of the dispersal material's composition to confirm, and would require the Estonian and Finnish governments' cooperation in the investigation. The H-6Ks could be tracked from their course alteration but were operating in international airspace throughout their transit. The 3 events were individually legal. Their combination was not coincidental. Establishing that combination as an organized, coordinated operation in any legal form would require a chain of evidence that did not yet exist at 2:09 a.m. At 2:14:09 a.m., 25 seconds after the Swedish military duty officer classified the return as a probable aerial dispersal event, the JAS-39 Gripen alert package at Ronneby Air Force Base had 2 aircraft at 4-minute cockpit alert. Sweden had maintained a Baltic air policing rotation for 19 months since its NATO accession, and the Baltic air policing standing rules of engagement authorized alert aircraft to launch against unidentified and anomalous returns in Swedish-controlled airspace without further authorization. The duty officer transmitted the alert launch authorization at 2:14:22 a.m. The 2 Gripens were airborne at 2:18:41 a.m., 4 minutes and 19 seconds from launch authorization. Their assignment was to identify the source of the dispersal return and intercept any airborne contacts whose flight profiles were inconsistent with filed flight plans in the affected sector. The An-12 was the most visible anomaly. It had already resumed its logged course by 2:14 a.m. After the dispersal, it had continued southeast for 12 minutes, performed a standard course correction maneuver, and was now back on a heading consistent with its Kaliningrad destination. When the Gripens reached sector ESAA at 2:31 a.m., the An-12 was 140 nautical miles east-southeast, outside the alert aircraft's initial intercept range. The Gripens established a patrol pattern in the dispersal zone and transmitted their sensor data to the Air Operations Center. The H-6Ks were the more significant contact. At 2:31 a.m., when the Gripens were establishing their patrol in sector ESAA, the Global Eye surveillance aircraft operating from Linköping transmitted a contact track on 3 large aircraft at 9,200 meters bearing 048 degrees, range 310 nautical miles from the dispersal zone, moving southwest at 790 knots. The track was assessed by the Air Operations Center's duty officer at 2:33 a.m. as consistent with H-6K bomber airframes on a course that would bring them to within 150 nautical miles of Swedish airspace in approximately 22 minutes if they maintained their current heading. The Chaff cloud's radar masking effect had degraded the GIWS ground. Radar network's coverage of the northwestern approach corridor for the preceding 24 minutes. The Global Eye was operating above the Chaff band and had maintained coverage. Its detection of the H-6Ks at 310 nautical miles provided the Air Operations Center with 22 minutes of warning. At 2:33:17 a.m., NATO's Baltic Air Policing Combined Air Operations Center at Weidum in Germany received the Swedish assessment through the Allied Air Command Network. The CAOC duty officer's response was immediate. The alert package at Šiauliai Air Base in Lithuania, 2 Danish F-16s in the current rotation, was authorized to launch and proceed toward an intercept heading at maximum speed. The F-16s were airborne at 2:37:44 a.m. At 2:41 a.m., the H-6Ks altered course again, not back toward the Barents Sea, further southwest to a heading of 231 degrees that brought them toward the Baltic proper, inside the 150 nautical mile radius from Swedish airspace. That had been the Air Operations Center's trigger threshold. The course alteration was being tracked continuously by the Global Eye. The Chaff cloud's masking effect had degraded to 60% effectiveness by this point. The atmospheric mixing was breaking up the particle density. But the GIWS ground network's coverage was still reduced in the northwestern corridor. The 150 nautical mile threshold was not a legal boundary. International airspace began 12 nautical miles from any state's coastline. The H-6Ks were in international airspace throughout their entire transit. They had a legal right to be where they were. The threshold was a military planning construct that defined the range at which large strike aircraft became an active planning variable for the air defense of the NATO members whose airspace they were approaching. At 2:44 a.m., 35 minutes after the Chaff dispersal had been detected, the Swedish Air Operations Center transmitted an intercept tasking to the 2 Gripens in sector ESAA. The Gripens repositioned from the dispersal zone patrol to an intercept heading, moving to close on the H-6Ks from the south while the Danish F-16s closed from the southwest. The intercept geometry placed the 2 Swedish aircraft ahead of the H-6K formation and the 2 Danish aircraft on a closing vector from the starboard side. The H-6K formation's crew were aware of the intercept. The Global Eye's active radar emissions were detectable at their range. The Swedish and Danish aircraft's approach had been monitored by the H-6K formation's own electronic support measures for several minutes. At 2:47 a.m., the lead H-6K's crew transmitted on the International Aviation Emergency Frequency. 3 Chinese military aircraft conducting a joint exercise in international airspace following standard air navigation procedures, not conducting any hostile activity. The transmission was logged at every air traffic control and military air operations center monitoring the frequency in the Northern European theater. It was a communication that established on the record the H-6K's characterization of their own activity. Peaceful, legal, routine. It was also the first transmission the H-6Ks had made since they altered course, which meant it had been made at the moment when intercept geometry was becoming apparent rather than as a proactive communication when the course alteration began. At 2:51:33 a.m., the lead Gripen established visual contact with the H-6K formation at 9,200 meters altitude over the international waters of the northern Baltic. The intercept was conducted under standard NATO air-to-air intercept procedures. The Gripen positioned itself at the formation's left wing, 300 meters of lateral separation, and transmitted a visual and radio identification of the formation. The lead H-6K acknowledged the identification. The exchange was recorded and transmitted to the CAOC. The 14 minutes during which the Gripens and Danish F-16s maintained their intercept positions on the withdrawing H-6K formation produced intelligence beyond the visual identification of the aircraft. The Gripens' electronic support measures had been recording the H-6K's own emissions throughout the intercept, their navigation radar, their communications equipment, and the electronic support measures receivers that the H-6Ks were using to track the intercepting aircraft. The data record from the intercept would allow the Swedish Signals Intelligence Directorate to refine its characterization of the specific H-6K variants involved, distinguishing between the H-6K's standard export configuration and the H-6K's domestic configuration that carried the CJ-20 air-launched cruise missile. The distinction was operationally significant. The H-6K in its domestic configuration had a standoff range that, from the 187 nautical mile closest approach point, would have placed cruise missile release points well within range of targets in Sweden and Finland. The H-6K in its export configuration carried a different payload that had a significantly shorter standoff range. The electronic emissions profile would allow the Swedish analysis team to determine which variant they had intercepted, and therefore what the 187 nautical mile closest approach represented in operational terms. The intercept had been a safety operation. It had also been a collection event whose data would inform Swedish air defense planning for the following operational cycle. The H-6K formation altered course a third time at 2:53 a.m., this time to 310 degrees, turning back toward the northeast and increasing speed to 830 knots. The withdrawal had begun. The H-6Ks had reached 187 nautical miles from Swedish airspace at their closest point of approach. They had not entered any nation's airspace. They had not activated any weapon system. They had not transmitted anything other than the 2:47 a.m. emergency frequency notification. The Gripens and the Danish F-16s maintained their intercept positions on the H-6K formation for 14 minutes as the bombers withdrew, then returned to their patrol assignments at 3:07 a.m. The Chaff cloud dispersed completely at approximately 3:19 a.m. The GIWS radar network's full coverage capability was restored at 3:21 a.m., 74 minutes after the dispersal had begun. At the Air Traffic Control Center in Stockholm, the flight plan of the An-12 had been flagged for investigation at 2:16 a.m. The Estonian Aviation Authority flagged the same aircraft's overflight at 2:41 a.m. Finnish Finavia flagged its transit of their sector at 2:49 a.m. 3 air traffic control authorities in 3 countries had independently flagged the same aircraft's route as inconsistent with its filed flight plan. The Estonian flag reached the Estonian Defense Intelligence Center at 2:53 a.m., which transmitted a preliminary assessment to the NATO Baltic Air Policing Framework at 3:04 a.m. The An-12's route deviation corresponded precisely to the Chaff dispersal zone. The timing corresponded precisely to the H-6K course alteration, and the combination was assessed as a probable coordinated deception and approach operation. The meteorological and atmospheric data from the night of the operation were collected by the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute as part of its routine archival process, and became available to the Air Defense Analysis Team the following morning. The data confirmed that the Chaff dispersal had been timed with reference to the wind profile at the dispersal altitude. The wind at 6,000 feet over the Gulf of Bothnia at 2:07 a.m. was 14 knots from 270 degrees, which meant the chaff cloud was moving eastward and spreading across the radar coverage geometry at a rate that the dispersal's designers had calculated to produce maximum radar degradation in the specific GIWS coverage sector that mattered for the H-6K approach corridor. The wind direction and speed had been forecast accurately by European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts 48 hours earlier. The forecast data was publicly available. The operational planning had used public meteorological data to optimize the timing of a radar masking operation. The tool that had helped design the masking was the same tool that the Weather Service used to forecast rain for a weekend football match. Time from chaff dispersal to detection, 2 minutes. Time from detection to alert aircraft launch, 9 minutes 22 seconds. Time from launch to visual intercept of H-6K formation, 33 minutes. H-6K closest approach to Swedish airspace, 187 nautical miles. Total GIWS radar degradation duration, 74 minutes. And 12 route deviation, flagged by 3 ATC centers in 3 countries, cross-correlated within 57 minutes. H-6K formal withdrawal, 2:53 a.m., 44 minutes after first course alteration towards Swedish airspace. NATO CAOC assessment at 3:15 a.m. Coordinated multi-actor deception operation, probable PRC Russia coordination. No violations of international airspace, full technical and legal documentation preserved for diplomatic action. The legal documentation was the outcome that the Air Operations Center's duty officer had been most deliberate about preserving since 2:14 a.m. Every radar track, every transmission, every visual intercept position had been recorded with timestamps and coordinates that placed the entire operation in a factual record suitable for presentation in any diplomatic or legal forum. The operation had produced no airspace violation. It had produced a 74-minute radar degradation window, a demonstration that large strike aircraft could be positioned 187 nautical miles from Swedish airspace under radar cover, and a legal record that was clear about what had occurred and unclear about what it meant in the context of international law. The 3 separate ATC flagging events: Stockholm at 2:16 a.m., Estonian Aviation Authority at 2:41 a.m., Finavia at 2:49 a.m., represented the most visible element of a broader monitoring picture whose individual components had each been operating independently. The Stockholm flag had been generated by a controller following standard procedures for anomalous radar returns. The Estonian flag had been generated by an automated route deviation monitoring system that compared actual transponder tracks against filed flight plans. The Finavia flag had been generated by a duty officer who had been notified by his Estonian counterpart at 2:45 a.m. and had conducted his own verification before submitting his flag at 2:49 a.m. 3 independent nodes in 3 separate national aviation systems had each identified the same anomaly through their own procedures. The cross-correlation that had produced the coordinated deception assessment at 3:04 a.m. had been the product of human analysis at the Estonian Defense Intelligence Center connecting the 3 flags, not of any automated system that had been designed to perform this specific correlation. The automated systems had flagged. The human had connected. The connection had taken 57 minutes from the first flag to the published assessment. The question that the Air Operations Center's post-incident review would spend 3 sessions addressing was why the connection required 57 minutes when all three flags were visible in the same intelligence fusion architecture at the same time. The clarity of the legal record was not a comfort. It was a measure of the gap between what international law could document and what it could prevent.